We are trucking our way through the Gospel of Matthew, and we are at Lesson 13. We're going to cover the first part of Matthew chapter 11, if the Lord wills. So we come here to Matthew chapter 11, and Matthew chapter 11 is part of a bigger section that covers not just chapter 11, but also chapter 12. And what these are is a clump of narrative, and they come in between two major discourses of Matthew. These are the big clumps of teaching that Matthew has for us. And so, like we've seen and like we've talked about a bunch, Matthew, as his gospel account is structured, you have a big clump of narrative, then a big clump of teaching, big clump of narrative, big clump of teaching, so on and so forth. We're at a part now where we're back to a big clump of narrative before we come eventually to Matthew chapter 13, where he has a big discourse, a lot of teachings, where he tells a lot of parables that pertain to the kingdom. And so we're inching our way toward that, where we really get a lot of insight into the kingdom. And a lot of scholars think of Matthew chapter 13 as sort of the climax of Matthew's gospel in terms of the teaching aspect of it. The climax of it would obviously be Jesus' death, burial, resurrection, so on. But Matthew 13 is kind of a pinnacle point in terms of the teachings that Jesus gives us. And we're inching our way toward that, but for now we find ourselves in the midst of this narrative. And remember the context of when this narrative is taking place. It's taking place after Jesus has instructed the 12. And so in verse 1 of this chapter, it says, "When Jesus had finished instructing his 12 disciples, he went on from there to teach and preach in their cities." And so the 12 have been sent out. Mark's gospel says that they're sent out in pairs. They're going about and doing these things. And Jesus is not going to just be idle while they're doing this. He goes about and he's also going to be preaching and teaching in their cities. And so the work for Jesus never stops. He doesn't get any breaks. He has some periods of solitude from time to time. But for the most part, Jesus is out there working. And we see here in Matthew chapters 11 and 12 that this is no exception to that. So as we come to this section of narrative, a common thread that you can find weaving through this unit of story is that of rejection and acceptance. It comes up over and over and over again, to the point where some look at this as triadic sort of structures, where you have two examples of rejection and one place where he shows how to accept it, so on and so forth. I think that's a bit of a stretch, and so I'm not going to think about that as we go through this, but it's interesting to think about. But there are a lot of threads of rejecting Jesus and then what it takes to accept Jesus as you go through this. And really, this is a lot of what Matthew's gospel is about, what it means to be a disciple of Jesus, what it looks like to accept Jesus, what it looks like to reject Jesus, and so on and so forth. And so what we see happening here, and really what we are seeing throughout Matthew's gospel account, is Jesus is going about doing these things. He's teaching, he's preaching, he's also performing miracles here. We're going to see Jesus perform some miracles in this section. We won't read about it today, but there's some things that he does in this section, and it makes you wonder, how are they going to respond to what Jesus has to say and what Jesus is doing? And their response obviously has kingdom implications. How you respond determines your place in the kingdom and if you're part of the kingdom or not. And so this is what we're going to see as we go through this section. And so this is kind of a big chunk of narrative. There's a lot of things that happen here, and so this is how I've broken it up. Hopefully it won't take us 5 classes to get through this, but it might, depending on my pace. And so today we're going to look at the first 15 verses of chapter 11, where it pertains to John the Baptizer and the kingdom. There's an example of something that John does here, and Jesus uses John as an example to talk about the kingdom. And we'll touch on that now. So we've already read verse 1. Now we come to verse 2, where it says, "Now when John heard in prison about the deeds of the Christ, he sent word by his disciples and said to him, 'Are you the one who is to come, or shall we look for another?'" we come now, and John is back in the picture. This, of course, is, again, John the Baptizer, John the Baptist, John the Immerser, whatever you want to call him. All of those would apply. And we see that John is back in the picture. Can anyone recall the last time we read about John in Matthew's gospel account off the top of your head? Because it's been a while. He's been absent for a period. You have my notes there. Or are you just a good student? CJ's cheating. No, he's a good student. He hasn't been in the story since Matthew chapter 3. John baptizes Jesus, and then we don't really see or hear from him again until this moment here when John is back in the story. And what we see about John is he is in prison. And although John hasn't been in the story, he's been mentioned. And we see that he's in prison in chapter 4 in verse 12. I'll read that briefly for you. It says, when he heard, this is speaking of Jesus, when he heard that John had been arrested, he withdrew into Galilee. So you may remember Jesus, in chapter 4, he's tempted, he's in the Judean wilderness, and all of a sudden he withdraws and he goes to Galilee. And the reason for that is because of the arrest of John. The arrest of John leads directly to Jesus going to Galilee. At least that's the implication that Matthew gives us as he records this story. And so this leads to Jesus withdrawing from the region of Judea, which would include Jerusalem, into the region of Galilee, which is actually where Jesus is from. His hometown of Nazareth is there. There's been a lot of things. Capernaum is there. There's a lot of things that Jesus has been doing. And at this point in Matthew's gospel, his ministry in Galilee has been the main focus of what Jesus has been doing. And so while Jesus has been ministering in Galilee, he's been teaching and preaching and doing all of these miracles, John has been in prison. And we saw that back in chapter 4. And it's interesting, John is in prison, and yet he's hearing about the deeds of the Christ. You think a lot of times when you're in prison, you're in isolation, and so you're kind of disconnected from the real world. And in some cases, maybe that might be true, but for the most part, you're not totally isolated from the real world. You can get some ideas of what's going on. And John is hearing, evidently, about the deeds of the Christ. And so this just shows you, one, how far the reputation of Jesus has spread. It's not just among the different cities, but even those in prison are hearing about Jesus. And so word is spread all over, and it's spread pretty quickly about Jesus and the things that he's been doing. And it's not just Jesus himself that has been the talk of the town, but it's the deeds of the Christ is what we see Matthew draw to our attention here, what John had been hearing about. He heard about the deeds of the Christ. And so the deeds have, of course, been among the main focuses of Matthew's account. And we'll actually get an idea of what Matthew means when he talks about the deeds of the Christ here in a moment. But before we get to there, we see also that he's in prison, John is. He's heard about the deeds of the Christ. And he sent word by his disciples. It's interesting to think about how John could have disciples, because sometimes we think about that and we think, well, how can John have disciples while Jesus has disciples? Wouldn't John send his disciples over to Jesus? And it's interesting because in John's gospel account, that's more or less what John does in John chapter 3. When in that account, if I'm recalling it correctly, John's disciples come up to him and they say, well, he's doing all of these miracles. More people are coming to him. And that's where you have in John 3 and verse 30 where John the Baptizer says, well, he must increase and I must decrease. In other words, he needs all of the attention. I need to fall back into the limelight because, as John says in John 1, behold the Lamb of God. This is the one who's come to take away the sins of the world. This is the one who John has come to be the forerunner of. He is the Christ. He's the one that we've been waiting for. And so it's interesting to think about how John could have disciples, but evidently he does. And these are people that were followers of John. And so they're following in the things that John had been teaching, following in the things that John perhaps had been doing. So perhaps maybe they're living a life similar to that of John, living off the land with the hare, right? And eating the wild locusts and honey and so on. But he has these disciples, and we've seen these disciples before. You may recall back in chapter 9, John's disciples come and they ask Jesus a question. They say, we fast, the Pharisees fast, why aren't your disciples fasting? That's the question that they ask Jesus. And that's where Jesus gives the answer of, you don't mourn when the bridegroom is present, and so on and so forth. And so we've seen John's disciples before, and we see them again here. And they come, and John, through his disciples, they ask this question: are you the one who is to come, or shall we look for another? This is a really interesting question. The question itself isn't that interesting. It's a common question that you might ask when seeing the things that Jesus is doing or hearing the things he's doing. But what's interesting about this is it's John who's asking the question. What's interesting about this is John, you would think, would have already known the answer to this question. And you can think back to, in John's gospel account, in John 1 and verse 29, where he says, behold the Lamb of God. John had some sort of sense as to who Jesus was. And so there's questions about why John would have asked this question through his disciples. Perhaps maybe it didn't quite register to John. Maybe he had the lip service, but he hadn't quite come to that discernment in his mind or in his heart yet. Or perhaps, as some people think, maybe he's asking this question for his disciples' benefit. Maybe this is John's way of showing his disciples that this truly is the Christ. And so it's an interesting thing to think about as to why John would ask this question. Does John really need to know this? Did he not already know it? Is he asking this for the benefit of his disciples? I don't really have a concrete answer. I would think John would have had an understanding of this, but maybe he didn't have a full understanding. It's similar to in Matthew 16 when Peter tells Jesus, you're the Christ, you're the Son of the living God, and he has the terms right, but he doesn't quite understand what that means. Maybe this is a similar situation for John, or maybe he's asking this for his disciples' benefit. CJ?
Well, maybe there's an element of doubt. He's now in prison, he's isolated, and so maybe he's starting to doubt his own mission. You know, I was supposed to be sending people to Jesus. Is this not the coming one now?
Well, CJ raises a point about how perhaps because John has been isolated in prison, maybe that has led to some doubts in John's mind. And you got to keep in mind, John hasn't actually seen the things that Jesus has been doing. John is arrested, and that's when Jesus withdraws to Galilee, and that's when he starts doing some of these things. And so maybe John, he has the idea in his mind, but he hasn't seen the work that Jesus has been doing, so maybe that's part of it as well. So they ask the question, are you the one who is to come, or shall we look for another? And Jesus gives them quite an answer. He answered them, go and tell John what you hear and see. The blind receive their sight, and the lame walk. The lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear. And the dead are raised up. And the poor have good news preached to them. So they ask this question, are you the one who's to come, or are we waiting for another person? Jesus simply says, tell John what you've seen and what you've heard, and he can come to his own conclusion. That's the idea here. And so what they are to do, what Jesus tells them to do, is to go and tell John what they've seen and what they've heard. Go tell him this eyewitness testimony. And that is by and large what we have here in Matthew's gospel account as well. Eyewitness testimony is very credible. That's why it's so important when a crime is committed that you have eyewitnesses, and that they are able to give their testimony. They're able to present to those who weren't there what happened. And then you can piece together with that evidence what really happened. People think about the gospel accounts, and they say, well, you hear people say, well, that's just made up stuff. These men saw this with their own eyes. Matthew would be one who saw these things with his own eyes. He was one of the 12. He's one who had a pretty close relationship with Jesus. And so eyewitness testimony is very important. And that's what Jesus says to go and give to John. Tell him what you've seen. Tell him what you've heard. And now we can get into some of the specifics. You see initially that you see the blind receive their sight, the lame walk, lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear. And so what John has inquired about, what has led to John's curiosity in the first place, is the deeds of the Christ. He's heard about the deeds of the Christ, and he asked this question. Well, this is what John is inquiring about, or that's the motivation for his inquiry. And Jesus tells him, go and tell him what you've seen and what you've heard. These works that Jesus has done, they're laid out for us here as Jesus describes it. Blind are receiving their sight. Lame are able to walk. Lepers are cleansed. And deaf are able to hear. These are things that Jesus has been doing. And so what we see is Matthew's definition, Jesus' definition really, as to what the deeds of the Christ really are. And it starts with these healings. There's these healings that Jesus does, making the lame walk, blind receiving sight, deaf being able to hear, so on and so forth. Another work of the Christ is raising the dead. We saw this with Jairus' daughter. That's already happened. This is something that Matthew's already recorded for us. This is something that they would have seen. And so here's another example of credible eyewitness testimony pertaining to something that Jesus has done. These are things that they all would have seen. They would have beheld all of these things. And raising the dead is one of them. And by the way, again, that's foreshadowing what Jesus is going to do. He's going to be raised from the dead at the end of the story. And notice another part of the work of the Christ is preaching. The poor have good news preached to them. The good news is, of course, the gospel. That's what the word gospel literally means, is the good news. And so we see here the work of the Christ. And remember also that this is the same thing that Jesus has instructed the 12 to go out and to do these healings, to raise the dead. Jesus gave them the authority to do these things. And remember what he told the apostles to preach. Repentance because of the coming kingdom. Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And so we see here, in a nutshell, the works of the Christ. Healings, raising of the dead, and preaching. And that is by and large what Matthew has been recording for us. That's what he's going to continue to record for us. This is what Jesus has now delegated to his apostles. And these are the things that Jesus is doing that are ultimately going to lead to Jesus being crucified, because the Jews don't like the things he's doing. That, of course, fits the idea here in this section of the response of Jesus. Are you going to accept it, or are you going to deny it? Are you going to reject it, or are you going to own up for it? And so Jesus gives them this answer. Tell John what you've seen. Tell him what you've heard. You've seen these things happening. What we see is that these works that Jesus is doing, it showcases his authority, and it proves that Jesus is who he says he is. He truly is the one who was to come. The one who was to come has come. He is here. He's arrived. And he tells John's disciples to go and make that known to him. And Jesus adds one more thing to what he tells John's disciples. And this is a really interesting thing to add in verse 6. Blessed is the one who is not offended by me. This is an interesting expression that Jesus uses. And people a lot of times take this out of its context. And it's true outside of its context. But remember the context that he's speaking in here. What Jesus is talking about are the things he's doing, the deeds. He's drawing John's attention through his disciples to the deeds that he's been doing. Tell him the things you've seen, tell him you've heard, so on and so forth. And so he's talking about his deeds, and then he makes this statement, blessed is the one who is not offended by me. Well, what does being offended by Jesus have to do with the things he's doing? What this has to do is Jesus' deeds are so compelling. They can't be denied. There's eyewitness testimony about him. Jesus truly did these things. And we can't simply not respond to them. You have to have some sort of a response. And so, how are we going to respond? Are we going to respond by taking offense to the things that Jesus does, as the leaders are going to do? As we'll read throughout Matthew's gospel account, the Jewish leaders take great offense to the things that Jesus is doing, in part because of their own selfish intentions. But how will we respond? Will we take offense, or will we respond accordingly by following him? That is ultimately the question that Matthew is raising to his readers. He's recording these things that Jesus is doing, including the things that he's teaching, because those, again, are the works of the Christ. And so when it comes down to it, the work of Jesus is undeniable. You can't deny the things that he said and the things he did. These are true things. So how will you respond? Are you going to be offended, or are you going to be a follower of Christ? That is ultimately the question that Matthew has for his readers. And this is the question that Matthew has, or that Jesus poses for John's disciples. And as he says, it's a blessing to those who are not offended by the Christ. You have something, Daryl?
So what's confusing to me is Matthew 3, right? When John baptizes Christ. The voice of God comes down and says, "This is my son." Right then, I mean, and then now you fast forward to this thing, it kind of makes you wonder, mindset-wise, I mean, he was there to witness that. I mean, baptized him. And then he hears this voice of God saying, "This is my beloved son, who I am well pleased." So, again, is it something where John, being a Jewish man, right, was assuming, like a lot of people, that this was going to be like a physical king that was coming over to take over and rule the world? You know, it just, I don't know, it just seems kind of confusing, because that's pretty solid testimony. The voice of God comes down and tells you that this is my beloved son, and then yet here you are questioning, are you the one? You know, so I don't know.
Well, it's an interesting question, and Daryl, if you couldn't hear him, he's confused a little bit about why John would be sort of confused about this, because of the evidence that John has already seen. He baptized him, there's the voice that came from heaven, and word has spread about what Jesus has been doing, and so why respond in the way that he has? And Daryl raises a good point about perhaps the expectation of the Jewish Messiah is a little different than how Jesus ultimately fulfills that, because they expected a physical kingdom to be established. As Jesus is going to say, his kingdom is not physical, but it's spiritual. And each of us are part of that kingdom today, and perhaps that's part of it. Maybe the expectations were just a little bit off as to what Jesus truly is and what he truly would be.
They were very well aware of Isaiah, and when what Jesus gave them was stuff that Isaiah prophesied would come true. All that list that you have, Isaiah 35 and 61, and they're going back. Now's the time. The Messiah is coming to fruition. He's here,
Yeah.
and maybe that's what it's alluding to. Is it time? And a timeliness of it. Remember, he's his cousin, right?
Yeah, they're distant relatives somehow.
And you're in prison, right? So if you're thinking, hey, this guy might spring me, if he's all of a sudden in charge, you know? So who knows? I don't know.
See?
Jim Watson, he's a scholar that he is, says that John wasn't sending them over so much for his information, but for theirs. These are his disciples, his learners. And he's sending them over, he's their teacher. He says, you go see it. And you bring that back to them. So that they're going to lose John here in just a little time. And what are they going to do? That's the Messiah. So Jim thinks that John was actually teaching his disciples.
I lean toward that too. That's one of the things that I asked at the beginning. Is this possibly for John's disciples' benefit? That seems like a big part of it, if not the whole story. Because, like Steve pointed out, if you didn't hear him, they're going to lose John pretty soon. John is going to precede Jesus, and we'll read about his death pretty soon. And when John is gone, when their teacher's gone, what are they going to do? Hopefully they'll have the know-it-all to say, this is the one that we need to follow now. Our rabbi is gone, their rabbi being John. We need to follow Jesus now. How much time we got? Okay, we need to move on. So we come now to the first part of verse 7. And we see here that John's disciples, they go back to John. And as they're leaving, it says Jesus began to speak to the crowds concerning John. John was a pretty, I would assume, famous figure. He was doing the things there in Jerusalem before he was arrested. It drew a lot of attention just by nature of how he was doing these things, being in the camel hair and so on and so forth. And so now Jesus uses John as an example to teach a lesson about the kingdom. And so it's kind of an interesting pivot that Jesus does here, where John's disciples just so happen to come and ask Jesus this question. He sends them back, or they go back. And now Jesus is going to use this as a teaching opportunity for the rest who were there as it pertains to the kingdom. And so he starts in the rest of verse 7 through verse 8, and he says, "What did you go out into the wilderness to see? A reed shaken by the wind? What then did you go out to see? A man dressed in soft clothing? Behold, those who wear soft clothing are in kings' houses." And so now what we see Jesus doing is he's going back to when John was initially in the wilderness. That's what he's drawing them back to. They're looking back at when John is first in the picture. And he asks the question, what did you go out to see? He asks it repeatedly. And what he's doing here is he's questioning their motives as to why they went out to see John in the first place. What's the reason that you went out there? It's more than just a little spectacle sort of thing. There's a reason behind it. You're not going out just to see. There's something that's drawing you out there. And so he questions their motives in going out and seeing John. What is it that you were looking for when you went out there? And he asks a couple of, and these are rhetorical questions, because the answer to both of these is, of course, no. He says, are you going out to see a reed shaken by the wind? Are you going out to see a man dressed in soft clothing? These are examples that are kind of lost on us. But what Jesus is thinking of here when he uses these examples, a reed shaken by the wind, that would be just an ordinary thing. That would be something that was ordinary. If you have a reed out there, the wind blows, it's naturally going to shake. That's nothing too extraordinary. That's something that's natural. So you're not going out to see something ordinary. You're not going out just to observe nature. Nor are you going out to see something that's luxurious. Thinking about the example of a man dressed in soft clothing. Soft clothing, kind of like it is today, was a luxurious thing back then. And that's why he says those who wear soft clothing are in kings' houses. They're not in the wilderness, right? They're cooped up in the comfort of their home. And it's a king's house. So that speaks of this being a luxurious sort of thing. And so they're not going out to see something that's just in the ordinary, nor are they necessarily going out to see something that's luxurious. And remember also what John was wearing. What he was wearing wouldn't have been soft. He's wearing a garment of camel hair. He continues in verse 9. What then did you go out to see? A prophet? Yes, I tell you, and more than a prophet. And so we see Jesus affirm this question. This one is no longer rhetorical. This was their purpose in going out. They're going to hear what John has to say. And so they're going to see a prophet. And not just a prophet, but more than a prophet. He's more than just a prophet. He is a prophet, but he's more than that. And Jesus explains this. In verse 10, he says, "This is he of whom it is written, Behold, I send my messenger before your face, who will prepare your way before you." So once again, we see Matthew allude through the lips of Jesus a fulfillment of prophecy. This is, remember, a common thread in Matthew's gospel account. Fulfillment of prophecies. Most of the time it's Jesus who's the fulfillment, but here our attention is drawn to how John fulfills this. And this quotation comes from Malachi chapter 3 and verse 1. There's a lot about John that comes from Malachi, and it's interesting that Malachi is the last book of the Old Testament, And it segues pretty nicely when you turn the page and you look, and it's Matthew's gospel account. It segues pretty nicely when you look at what's written there, and then you continue on in Matthew, if you're just reading the Bible straight through. And so we see this from Malachi chapter 3 and verse 1. This is the one of who it's written. John is the fulfillment of this prophecy, this messenger who's preparing the way. And it's interesting to think about this. He says, I send my messenger before your face who will prepare your way before you. We read this and we think one thing, but Jewish readers would read this and they think of something else. One thing is there's obviously an expectation that they had of this person who was going to come and who's going to be the sort of forerunner, the one preparing the way. But this also makes them think of other things. There are other things in the Old Testament that are kind of similar to this. You think about this, and there's a really interesting parallel that you can make here. A messenger, and the Greek word for that is agalos. It's the same word that you could use that could be translated as angel. A messenger preparing the way to a Jewish reader that we assume Matthew's readers would have been, at least his initial readers. This would be reminiscent of Israel entering the land of Canaan. And the reason I say that is because of what we see in Exodus chapter 23 and verse 20, where it says, Behold, I send an angel. The Greek word that's used can be translated as angel. It commonly is. I send an angel before you to guard you on the way and to bring you to the place that I have prepared. So there's a way that's been prepared, a place that's been prepared, and angels are leading them to that. This is what's happening in Exodus. And so Malachi makes this reference here, and Jesus says John is the fulfillment of this. And so you have not just the fulfillment of what Malachi was doing, but you have an allusion to the Exodus, entering the promised land. You can make a parallel now, entering the kingdom, as what we see Matthew is going to record for us as to what Jesus is going to talk about. And so there's a lot going on here, parallel-wise, entering the old promised land versus now entering the new promised land, which is the kingdom. So we come to the first part now of Matthew 11 and verse 11. And it says, Truly I say to you, among those born of women, there has arisen no one greater than John the Baptist. And so he says this is the one that Malachi spoke of, and he just continues to heap the praises on to John by saying there's no one greater than John the Baptist. Among those born of women, there's no one greater. And so he's drawn their attention back to John, thinking of when they initially see him in the wilderness, when he's initially preaching. And Jesus gives him, as far as I can tell, one of the best compliments in all of the Bible, at least for earthly people. To say that there's no one greater than John, that's quite the compliment. Well, what Jesus is doing, he's setting up a point about the kingdom. There's a juxtaposition that's happening here, where you put two side by side and you see which one is greater. John is pretty great. Jesus says that. There's no one greater than John the Baptist among those born of woman. And yet we're going to see that there's still others that are greater. And we see that in the rest of verse 11. Yet, you see the contrast here, yet the one who is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. That's quite the compliment that Jesus has given John, yet it's almost sort of a backhanded compliment. Because on the one hand, he's elevating John, but he's elevating others higher than John. And the ones he's elevating are the least in the kingdom of heaven. Some look at this and they say, well, are there those that are least in the kingdom and greater in the kingdom? I thought we were all equals in the kingdom. Well, by and large, we are if we're the saints. That's not the point that Jesus is making here. There's a juxtaposition here that's happening, and he's making a case about those who are in the kingdom, even the least in the kingdom, if there are least in the kingdom, they're still greater than John. And so now there's this paradigm shift. You have those who have been born of women, among whom John is the greatest. Now you have those who are of the kingdom. And we see that the least of the kingdom are greater than John. And so what we see here is, again, this juxtaposition where you have two things side by side, and how do you compare them? What's their position like? You'd think John, being greater than everybody, would be pretty high, but you see that even the least in the kingdom are greater than him. And so this is quite a statement that Jesus is making. You could be the best person on earth, but even the lowest of the low in the kingdom is greater than the greatest of this earth. That says something pretty strong about the kingdom. This is a pretty important point that Jesus is making about being in the kingdom and the importance of that, and stressing that we need to be part of this kingdom. It's a rewarding thing to be part of this kingdom. And that's one of the things that Matthew is drawing out for us that Jesus has said. And so we see now the focus on the kingdom become a little more intense, and it's going to become really intense when we get to chapter 13. But Jesus is drawing us to this idea of the kingdom, and he mentions it here. And he goes on to say one of the most, I don't want to say controversial, because it's not controversial. It's just misunderstood, I guess. Or maybe not misunderstood, but not understood at all when we come to Matthew chapter 11 and verse 12. When he says, "From the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven has suffered violence, and the violent take it by force." This is a really puzzling thing that Jesus says. And it's interesting thinking about the kingdom suffering violence. I notice the time period that he mentions it. It's from the days of John until that present time. Relatively short amount of time. And he mentions that the kingdom of heaven has suffered violence. If you read commentaries going through Matthew, most, if not all of them, will say, well, no one really has any idea what Jesus is talking about. Here's kind of what we think, but they really don't know. No one really has any idea what Jesus means. And so this is one of, if not the most divisive verse in all of the Bible, certainly among the statements of Jesus. There's no clear consensus on its meaning in the realm of biblical scholarship. As smart as these guys are, they don't, or as smart as they think they are, I should say, they don't have any idea what Jesus is talking about. Which, in my experience, when there's something like that, it's usually much more simple than they think. And perhaps this is an example of that. I'm not saying I have it figured out. But one thing we need to remember is the context of what Jesus is talking about. Always remember the context. If you don't understand something, think about the context it's written in, and that usually gives it a little more meaning, and there's more understanding that can be had. Jesus is talking about the greatness of the kingdom and the greatness of those who are of the kingdom. And so remember that this is what Jesus has in mind, in particular the greatness of the kingdom. Because if you're of the kingdom and you're great, that means the kingdom you're part of is great. We're not the great ones, it's the kingdom that makes us great. That's the idea behind this. And he talks about how the violent have taken it by force. What seems to be going on here is, and remember, context in terms of the greatness of the kingdom, this kingdom is so great that people try to take it by force. And there's different connotations behind that. One way is you try to steal it. It doesn't belong to you and you try to steal it. That's one idea. Another idea is maybe you take it prematurely. Think about this. Pentecost hasn't happened yet. And so the kingdom Jesus hasn't even died yet. And so really, the kingdom is not ready to be had yet. And yet people are trying to take it prematurely. And you can see this happen in other gospel accounts. I think of in John's gospel when they try to make Jesus king by force before he withdraws and all of that. That's one example perhaps of this, where they try to take the kingdom by force prematurely, or perhaps kind of like what Daryl talked about, they have a misunderstanding about what the kingdom really is, if it's physical or if it's spiritual, or if it's going to be ushered in Jerusalem, and so on and so forth. One commentator, Bert Kaufman, alludes to this. The commentator's name is J.W. McGarvey, and he likens this to a city under siege, or he says that Jesus is likening this to a city under siege. That Michigan State game was going too late last night. I'm a little tired, if you haven't noticed. Kept waiting for one team to pull away so I could go to bed, and it didn't happen. So this is the quote. Bert Kaufman has this in his commentary on Matthew, and This is from McGarvey, and I have the citation at the bottom there. McGarvey says, Jesus here pictures the kingdom of heaven as a besieged city. And keep in mind, this is just a guy's opinion, but I think there's some validity to this to an extent. He pictures the kingdom of heaven as a besieged city. The city is shut up, but the enemies which surround it will storm its walls and try to force an entrance. The gates of Christ's kingdom were not opened until the day of Pentecost. That happens in Acts 2. But men, hearing it was about to be opened, sought to enter it prematurely, not by the gates which God would open, but by such breaches as they themselves sought to make in its walls. I don't know if this is exactly what Jesus has in mind when he makes this statement, but this makes a lot of sense when you think of it from that perspective. Because they had an expectation of the kingdom, and seemingly their expectation didn't line up with the reality of what the kingdom is. It didn't line up. They're thinking it's going to be a physical kingdom. They're thinking Jesus is going to dethrone Rome, and he's going to sit on the throne in Jerusalem, and so on and so forth. And there are still some, even Christians, who think of that today, that the kingdom will be ushered in Jerusalem at the present day. That's not going to happen. I think I can say that pretty concretely, and I hope I'm not being offensive in saying that, but it's an interesting thing to think about here. And so when you think about the kingdom is coming, and they've been told of its coming. They had expectations of it. They knew the prophecies of it. And not only that, but Jesus and John and the disciples, they've been talking about it. They've been saying over and over again, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And so people's attention has been drawn to this. And when you keep in mind the things that Jesus has already been doing, proving that he is who he says he is, giving credibility to the message that he has of the kingdom of heaven being at hand, it makes sense that people would try to take it by force prematurely, or if it doesn't belong to them, or what have you. And you think about this, and it's sort of amplified a little bit more by what Jesus goes on to say about John. When in verses 14 and 15 he says, if you're willing to accept it, he's speaking still of John, he is Elijah who is to come. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. And so, not only is John the one fulfilled from Malachi chapter 3, he doesn't directly quote it, but he alludes to it. John is also the Elijah to come. This is a reference from the same book, from the book of Malachi. This is in chapter 4 and verse 5. This is the last words of the New Testament. When in Malachi 4, there's verse 5, and I think there's another verse after that, which I don't have on the screen, so I'll read it. Malachi 4, verses 5 and 6. It says, behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes. And he will turn the hearts of fathers to their children, and the hearts of children to their fathers, lest I come and strike the land with a decree of utter destruction. That's the last words of the Old Testament. And it's interesting that Jesus quotes this, and he mentions that this is speaking of John. John is the Elijah to come. And what we see going on here is the signs of the coming kingdom were certainly there, on top of what they were preaching. And so the signs have been there. Jesus has done many of these signs. And one sign is also of John being there. And you have also their expectations. They knew what to look for. And they're seeing these things happening before their eyes. And you think about this. This is again from Malachi 4. I will send you Elijah the prophet before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes. Elijah coming means the day of the Lord is coming. Jesus says that Elijah was there. And so that day of the Lord, the coming of the kingdom, was imminent. It was, in Jesus' words, at hand. And so you have this allusion of John from Malachi 4, and you have the preaching that's already happened. I've mentioned it before, but I have it on the screen here. This is John the Baptizer himself, saying, in those days John the Baptist came in the wilderness of Judea, and he's preaching, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. It's at hand. That means it is near. It is imminent. And in Acts 2, it's going to be opened up. We see also Jesus. From that time on, this is in Matthew 4, Jesus began to preach, saying, "Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand." It is close. It is within reach. And think also about when Jesus delegates to his apostles, he tells them to say the same thing. Proclaim as you go, saying, "Repent," or saying, "The kingdom of heaven is at hand." And so you have all of this stacking up. You have a lot of evidence here. And Matthew does a great job of showing us this as Jesus is talking about this. And it's interesting how this little section about John ends when Jesus says, "He who has ears to hear, let him hear." This expression, one of my professors at Harding would use this all the time when he'd make an important point. "He who has ears to hear, let him hear." And it annoyed me because it's kind of annoying, but I kept thinking, who's this guy think he is, Jesus? This expression accomplishes multiple things. One, it draws attention to Jesus' words. In other words, hey, you better pay attention to what I'm saying. That's more or less what that means. But it also typically marks the end of a literary unit, where typically you move on from this unit and you transition to another one. And that's kind of what's going to happen in this part here. And it's interesting to think also about those who have ears and don't hear, because you'd think if you have ears that work, you can hear. I know some of us have ears that don't necessarily work all that well. That's why you have to have these microphones and so on and so forth. Because I probably don't need one. I'm loud enough, but it's beneficial. But this is a common expression in the Old Testament, having ears but not hearing. And it speaks to the stubbornness to not listen to what's being said and not listening to what is clearly the right thing. There's references from Isaiah 6, Jeremiah 5, Ezekiel 12. Each of these apply to the people of Israel being stubborn. They've been told about what's going to happen if they don't change. They don't change. And what they've been warned about happens. And so Jesus uses that same expression pertaining to this unit here. And so what we see Jesus speaking of here, the kingdom is imminent. It is coming. It's going to be here. This is something you need to be a part of. People are trying to get in. They're trying to force their way in. We'll see as we continue through Matthew's gospel account how you become part of that kingdom. And we'll see it really at the end when he gives the Great Commission. Thanks for your attention.